You are welcome to yet another episode of HN What's Your Say? The #1 listening show, where we discuss real issues with real people like you. We are still featuring R. Kelly. Real name Robert Sylvester Kelly. Also known as the R&B King. When we think about the foundations of a fair and just legal system, one of the core principles is that a defendant must be tried based solely on the charges presented against them and nothing more, nothing less. However, in the case against R. Kelly, his defense team has long argued that this sacred principle was not just ignored but also trampled upon. In the courtroom where Robert Sylvester Kelly, better known to the world as R. Kelly, was put on trial, the defense raised serious and well-founded concerns about the admission of certain testimonies and materials. These inclusions, they argue, were not just irrelevant to the specific charges at hand but were highly prejudicial. And when you examine the details, it becomes clear that this wasn't merely an accidental overstep. It was a calculated strategy, one that exploited emotional manipulation and character assassination to win a conviction not based on evidence tied directly to the charges, but on a distorted portrayal of the man himself. Let's start with the basics. R. Kelly was charged with a limited set of specific crimes. These were clearly defined in the indictment and should have provided the scope for what the jury was expected to weigh. But when the prosecution began to present their case, what unfolded was not a targeted effort to prove these allegations beyond a reasonable doubt, but instead a sprawling and sweeping attack on his character. Approximately 45 prosecution witnesses took the stand during the trial. And yet R. Kelly was only formally charged for a fraction of the claims these witnesses alluded to. Why then were so many people called upon to testify? The answer, according to his defense team, is rather troubling. The prosecution sought to flood the courtroom with stories, anecdotes, and accusations that had nothing to do with the actual charges, but everything to do with painting R. Kelly as an irredeemably bad person in the eyes of the jury. Meanwhile, this strategy of bringing in excessive and unrelated testimony is not unique to this case. In fact, it's internationally recognized as a prejudicial tactic, and it's designed not to establish facts relevant to the charges, but to overwhelm jurors with negativity and distraction. It creates a psychological trap, and instead of weighing the actual charges, jurors begin to form a broader moral judgment of the defendant. They're no longer asking, did he commit this specific crime? And instead they're thinking, he seems like a bad guy. He must be guilty of something. This kind of evidential overload undermines the principle of presumption of innocence. And in R. Kelly's case, it turned the courtroom into something resembling a public tribunal. A place where he was judged not by facts, but by sentiment. And among the witnesses were individuals whose experiences were not tied to the charges in question. They were not testifying to provide evidence of the alleged crimes in the indictment. They were there to contribute to a broader narrative, one meant to sway emotion among the jurors. Meanwhile, some of these witnesses recounted encounters or experiences from decades ago. Others spoke of situations that were never reported to law enforcement, never documented, and never scrutinized through a proper legal process. Still, these accounts were presented to the jury as though they held the same weight as substantiated charge-related evidence. And what's more, many of these testimonies lacked corroboration. In a court of law, evidence is king, or at least it should be. Allegations, especially those not tied to specific charges, should be rigorously vetted before being admitted into evidence. But in this trial, it seems the normal gatekeeping function of the court was either diminished or completely disregarded. R. Kelly's defense team objected to this repeatedly. They pointed out that the inclusion of uncharged acts and unrelated accusations would inherently bias the jury. But those objections were overruled. And the result, a trial that became a referendum on R. Kelly as a person, rather than a measured legal examination of whether or not he committed the crimes for which he was actually charged. Let's put this into perspective. Imagine being on trial for theft and the prosecution calling dozens of people to testify that they once saw you arguing in public, or that you seemed arrogant, or maybe that someone somewhere heard rumors you had bad intentions. None of that would be relevant to whether or not you stole something. But once that many people paint you in a negative light, even the most impartial juror would begin to feel swayed. Now that's not justice but rather persuasion through character assassination. And there's another layer here that's crucial, the notion of relevance in legal proceedings. In U.S. Law Rule 403, the Federal Rules of Evidence allows a judge to exclude evidence if its probative value is substantially outweighed by the danger of unfair prejudice. In other words, even if a piece of evidence has some relevance, if it's going to distract the jury or lead them to decide based on emotion rather than fact, it should be kept out. Yet in this case against R. Kelly, it appears the court gave wide latitude to the prosecution to do this. Witness after witness, irrelevant testimony was allowed to present emotional and often inflammatory testimony. Testimony that wasn't designed to answer the central questions of the case but to provoke moral outrage, and it worked. The emotional toll these stories had on jurors is not hard to imagine. But again, this is not supposed to be a trial about feelings. It's supposed to be about facts. Let's go deeper. Some witnesses testified about events that allegedly occurred in the 1990s and early 2000s well outside the statute of limitations and with no direct tie to the charges being tried in court. Why allow these testimonies at all? The defense argued that their inclusion served only one purpose: to create a prejudicial atmosphere in the courtroom. The jury wasn't hearing evidence of the crimes in question. They were being fed a narrative that R. Kelly had a long unchecked history of inappropriate behavior regardless of the specifics or the verifiability of each claim. In doing so, the prosecution sidestepped the burden of proof. Rather than proving each charge beyond a reasonable doubt, they sought to drown the jury in such an overwhelming volume of accusations that turned out to be irrelevant to the case. When you hear 45 people speak poorly of someone, the natural human reaction is to assume guilt even if not one of those stories is directly tied to the charges at hand. And that's exactly the problem. That's not how the justice system is supposed to function. We don't convict people based on their reputation. We in fact convict them based on evidence tied directly to alleged criminal acts. When that line gets blurred, it sets a dangerous precedent not just for R. Kelly but for every defendant who enters a courtroom seeking a fair trial. The defense also highlighted the inconsistencies among some of these witnesses. When multiple people are brought in to testify about unrelated events, you would expect some discrepancies. But instead of scrutinizing these inconsistencies, the court allowed their statements to stand with no challenge. Cross-examinations were often limited, and the cumulative effect of hearing witness after witness make similar claims even if unsubstantiated had the effect of reinforcing the prosecution's narrative by sheer volume alone. What's more, in many cases the jury was not clearly instructed to disregard uncharged conduct or to weigh it separately. Without clear and consistent guidance from the bench, the average juror is unlikely to compartmentalize this kind of testimony. The lines between relevant and irrelevant and between charged and uncharged conduct become hopelessly blurred. In summary, what R. Kelly's defense team has laid out is not just a series of procedural complaints. It's a fundamental challenge to the fairness of the trial itself. When the court allows the inclusion of unrelated, emotionally charged and uncorroborated testimony from dozens of witnesses like it did, it transforms a legal proceeding into a spectacle. And while such spectacles may play well in the court of public opinion, they have no place in a courtroom dedicated to truth and justice. This is not a defense of R. Kelly's actions but rather a defense of due process. The idea that every individual, no matter how controversial, is entitled to a fair trial. A trial based on evidence and not innuendo. On facts, not feelings, and based on law, not emotional manipulation. If we allow courts to operate this way, to substitute character assassination for legal precision, then we're not just convicting one man unfairly. We're eroding the very principles that protect us all. If you want to be featured in our video releases, send us your clips by emailing them to hnnewsroom242@gmail.com or use Google Drive for larger files. Be sure to include your name and any details you'd like us to know. We can't wait to showcase your contributions. That is all we had for you today on HN What's Your Say. To keep updated whenever we post a new video, subscribe to this channel now. Also remember to hit the bell icon and enable notifications. And feel free to share your opinions with us in the comment section below, and let us know if you would like us to publish your views in our next release. We value all our subscribers' opinions.